The engineers at Wright Field studied the blueprints for the modified B-25 and didn't just reject them. They scoffed. They labeled the design impractical and recommended grounding the entire fleet, convinced that bolting 14 heavy machine guns to the nose of a bomber was a suicide pact with gravity. They believed a bomber's place was at 20,000 feet, dropping payloads by the book, not skimming the waves like a frantic fighter. But in their arrogance, those engineers forgot that the laws of aerodynamics bow to the sheer will of a man whose family is trapped in a Japanese prison camp. That aerodynamic impossibility didn't just fly. It turned the Bismarck Sea into a slaughterhouse, sinking 12 ships and sending 3,000 enemy soldiers to the bottom in a single morning. If you want to see how Pappy's folly taught the Imperial Navy a fatal lesson in ballistics, hit like, because the math of war is written in blood, not blueprints. The Imperial High Command did not speak of risk. They spoke of destiny. In the grand briefing rooms of Rabaul, the air was thick with the smoke of expensive tobacco and the intoxicating vapor of overconfidence. The plan for the reinforcement of Leh was not presented as a gamble. It was presented as a mathematical inevitability. 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, 7,000 men. The logistics officers pointed to the calendar and smiled. It was March, the monsoon season. To the Americans, the weather was an obstacle. To the Empire, it was a divine shield. The meteorologists promised low clouds, heavy rain, and visibility reduced to near zero. They assured the infantry commanders that the Bismarck Sea would be wrapped in a blanket of gray cotton, impenetrable to the prying eyes of Allied reconnaissance. The logic was sound, industrial, and cold. American bombers, the lumbering B-17 flying fortresses, operated from 15,000 feet. From that altitude, through breaks in the clouds, they were dropping unguided iron onto moving targets. A feat of ballistics that resulted in nothing but dead fish and wasted fuel. The High Command had analyzed the data. They had seen the splash patterns. They mocked the Yankee incompetence. They believed the Americans were technologically incapable of hitting a maneuvering ship from the stratosphere. The order was given with the weight of steel. The convoy would steam south through the Vitiaz Strait, hug the New Guinea coast, and unload the 51st Division at Leh by dawn on March 4th. It was a perfect machine of war, fueled by diesel and hubris, protected by the very sky itself. The radio waves crackled with the arrogant certainty of Tokyo. They broadcasted strength. They broadcasted the invincibility of the convoy system. The destroyers, the Shikinami, the Asashio, were not just ships. They were floating batteries of Type 96 anti-aircraft guns, manned by crews who had been drilled to perfection. They believed the Vitiaz Strait was their lake. The engines of the Teiyo Maru and the Kyokusei Maru churned the dark water, vibrating with the promise of deliverance. 15 knots. That was the speed of victory. The propaganda officers told the men that the Americans were afraid of the weather, that the 5th Air Force was grounded by the rain, that the White Devils lacked the spirit to fight in the storm. They painted a picture of a ghostly, silent passage where the only enemy was seasickness. They promised that the might of the Imperial Navy would brush aside any interference like a nuisance fly. They promised that the Emperor's will controlled the tides. They promised eternal glory. But the reality was March the 2nd, 1943, aboard the transport Teiyo Maru, below decks. The air down here, it tastes like oil and vomit. There are too many of us. packed into the hold like cargo, knees pressed against backs, backs pressed against cold steel hulls. The engines, they don't hum. They scream. A constant grinding scream that vibrates through the soles of my boots and settles in my teeth. The officers upstairs, on the bridge. They talk about the rain as if it is our ally. They say the clouds are hiding us, but I look at the faces of the men in my squad, and I see the truth. Private Sato is clutching his Type 99 rifle so hard, his knuckles are white, like bone. He whispered to me an hour ago. He said he heard the sailors talking. He said the storm isn't thick enough. The ship rolls, a heavy, sickening lurch to the port side, and the equipment racks groan. My pack, 50 pounds of kit, sits heavy on my lap. If we go into the water, this pack will not be a supply cache. It will be an anchor. The heat is suffocating. It smells of unwashed bodies, of fear, sweat, of damp wool. We are not soldiers down here. We are livestock waiting for the slaughter. I try to sleep, but every time the hull creaks, I think it is a torpedo. Every time a hatch slams, I think it is a bomb. The officers promised us we would be in lay by dawn. They promised us the Americans couldn't see us, but I feel eyes on us. I feel them through the steel plating. Someone is watching. I can feel the cold lens of a scope, somewhere up in that gray sky, looking down at this iron coffin and calculating the coordinates of my grave. The B-25 Mitchell was born a gentleman. It was designed in the clean, sterile hangars of North American aviation to be a high-altitude precision instrument. It was built to fly straight, level, and stable, allowing a bombardier and a glass greenhouse nose to peer through a Norden bomb sight and drop ordnance from 2 miles up. It was a machine of geometry and calculus. But in the sweat-soaked hangars of Townsville, Australia, that gentleman was murdered. What rolled out onto the tarmac was not a bomber. It was a Frankenstein monster of aluminum and hate, welded together by men who had stopped caring about factory warranties and started caring about survival. They called it a strafer. The ground crews, wiping grease from their brows, called it Pappy's folly. But the physics of the thing were terrifying. Paul Gunn, a 43-year-old ex-Navy mechanic with a vendetta, looked at the glass nose and saw wasted space. He ripped out the bombardier's station. He ripped out the delicate optical sights. And in their place, he installed a dense, horrifying shrine to kinetic energy. He mounted 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns directly into the nose, solid steel, fixed forward. Then he bolted 4 more guns into external cheek packs on the fuselage skin. He locked the top turret forward. He added 2 more on the sides. The math was sickening. 14 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns. This was not a modification. It was an act of industrial violence. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. The ammunition weighed hundreds more. The center of gravity shifted so aggressively forward that the aircraft naturally wanted to lawn dart into the earth. The 81st Air Depot Group worked 18-hour days, burning their retinas with welding torches, reinforcing the nose structure with heavy-gauge aluminum patches because the recoil of 14 guns firing simultaneously didn't just shake the airframe, it threatened to shear the rivets right off the skin. When the triggers were depressed, this flying artillery battery didn't just fire bullets, it projected a solid cone of destruction. 215 pounds of lead per second, 168 guns across a squadron of 12 planes. It was a flying chainsaw, 300 yards wide, capable of sawing a destroyer in half at the waterline. The blast tubes had to be welded to extend beyond the propellers because the muzzle flash was so violent it would peel the aluminum skin off the fuselage like a banana. This was the commerce destroyer. It was heavy, it was ugly, and it vibrated with a raw, mechanical malevolence that made the factory engineers in Ohio vomit in their wastebaskets. Inside the cockpit of the prototype, the air is stagnant and heavy with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Captain Paul Gunn sits in the pilot's seat, but he isn't flying an airplane anymore. He is wrestling a falling anvil. The control yoke is heavy in his hands, fighting him, pulling constantly toward the floorboards. The nose is so laden with guns and ammunition that the aircraft wants to drop out of the sky the moment he eases back pressure. His forearms burn, his shoulders ache. To keep this beast level requires a physical intimacy with the machine that is exhausting, just to fly in a straight line. He looks out over the nose, but the view has changed. Where there used to be a clear view of the horizon, now there is just metal and gun barrels, and the heat shimmer of engines running at maximum manifold pressure. The vibration is different here. It's not the smooth hum of a cruiser. It's a shudder. A nervous twitch in the aluminum skeleton that travels up through the seat cushion and into his spine. He is 43 years old. He should be behind a desk. He should be retired. But there is a picture in his head that drowns out the roar of the twin Wright cyclones. A picture of Santo Tomas, the internment camp in Manila. His wife, Polly, his 4 children, trapped behind barbed wire, eating rice gruel. Wasting away while he sits in a cockpit in Australia. He grips the throttle quadrant, and his knuckles are scarred from slipping wrenches and safety wire. He is not a pilot today. He is a father, and he has built a machine that converts his grief into ballistics. The noise inside this tin can is deafening. Wind noise, engine noise, the rattle of ammunition belts feeding into the breeches. Endless belts of death snake through the fuselage like copper intestines. It feels fragile, despite the guns. One lucky shot to the hydraulics, one piece of flak in the unarmored glass, and all this anger, all this engineering, plunges into the jungle canopy, but he holds the stick back. He feels the artificial horizon center itself, and he waits for the moment he can unleash the thunder. He is not fighting for a flag. He is fighting for the 6 people waiting for him in Manila, and God help anyone who gets in front of his nose. The logistics of the Southwest Pacific were not written in ink. They were written in rust and scavenged aluminum. In the European theater, the 8th Air Force received factory-fresh B-17s with the paint still curing, delivered on a schedule dictated by pristine bureaucratic ledgers. They had spare parts. They had tech manuals. They had coffee that was actually hot. But in New Guinea, the 5th Air Force was starving. General Kenny didn't have a supply line. He had a dripping faucet at the end of a 4,000-mile pipe. When Captain Paul Gunn needed firepower, he didn't fill out a requisition form in triplicate and wait 6 weeks for a cargo ship. He went to the boneyard. The boneyard was a graveyard of failures. It was a muddy patch of earth at the edge of the airfield where the jungle was slowly digesting the twisted carcasses of American air power. P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, aircraft that had ground-looped on landing, aircraft that had been strafed on the ground by Zeros, aircraft that had returned full of holes with pilots who didn't survive the flight home. The aluminum was torn, The cockpits were stained dark with dried blood. The engines were seized. But the guns were alive. Gunn's logistics were simple and brutal. Cannibalization. He organized teams of mechanics, men with grease under their fingernails and malaria in their blood, to strip the Browning M250 caliber machine guns from the wrecks. These were weapons designed for fighters, compact, air-cooled, recoil-operated beasts. They didn't belong in a bomber. They certainly didn't belong in a nose cone designed for a delicate optical bomb sight. But Gunn didn't care about belonging. He cared about density of fire. The modification process was an act of industrial heresy. There were no CAD drawings. There were no stress analysis reports. There were no wind tunnel simulations. Gunn drew the blueprints by hand, pencil sketches on greasy notepaper, smudged with sweat. The fabrication shop at the 81st Air Depot Group wasn't a clean room. It was a blacksmith's forge. Acetylene torches hissed day and night. The air smelled of ozone and melting steel. Mechanics worked 18-hour shifts. They didn't have mounting brackets, so they fabricated steel frames from scrap metal. They didn't have recoil dampeners, so they reinforced the airframe with heavy-gauge aluminum patches, doubling the skin thickness to prevent the vibration from shaking the aircraft apart. They didn't have flash suppressors, so they welded custom blast tubes to the muzzles to push the exploding gases past the propeller arc, ensuring the pilot didn't blind himself every time he pulled the trigger. The weight calculations were a nightmare. 4 nose guns, 4 cheek guns, 2 side guns, 200 pounds of ammunition, steel mounts, armored plating, total added weight, nearly 1,000 pounds, all hanging off the nose of the aircraft. The center of gravity, the holy grail of aerodynamics, shifted violently forward. In a standard aircraft, this creates a nose-heavy condition that makes takeoff impossible. The plane simply refuses to lift its head, plowing into the runway at 100 miles an hour. Gunn's solution wasn't elegant engineering. It was brute force displacement. He ripped the radio equipment out of the cockpit and moved it to the tail. He physically shifted heavy avionics boxes aft, using the plane's own guts as ballast to counterbalance the massive iron chin he had just bolted on. He adjusted the tail trim tabs to their absolute limit. It was a balancing act, performed with sledgehammers. When the engineers at Wright Field in Ohio finally saw the specifications, they choked on their coffee. They sent urgent cables, impractical, structurally unsound, aerodynamically unstable. They cited drag coefficients. They cited wing loading limits. They cited the factory manual. They were looking at numbers on a page. They didn't understand the logistics of desperation. They didn't understand that when you are outnumbered, outgunned, and your back is against the Owen Stanley Mountains, safety tolerances are a luxury you cannot afford. Gunn didn't use a slide rule to test his creation. He used a runway. He climbed into the cockpit of the prototype, a Frankenstein monster stitched together from dead fighters and a bomber, and he shoved the throttles to the stops. If the math was wrong, he died. If the welds failed, he died. If the center of gravity was off by 2 inches, he died. That was his feasibility study. The plane roared down the strip at Charter Towers. The nose wanted to drag. Gunn had to pull the control column back into his stomach, fighting the weight of 10 guns, fighting the physics, willing the heavy beast into the air. And it flew. It flew like it was angry. It flew like a brick with wings. But it flew. The factory engineers said it was impossible. The logistics said it was scarce. The manual said it was prohibited. But Paul Gunn had just built the first close air support gunship in history out of scrap metal and rage. The physics of aerial slaughter begins with a single number: 2,930 feet per second. That is the muzzle velocity of a standard 50 caliber M2 armor-piercing round. It is a projectile of copper-jacketed steel core, weighing nearly 2 ounces, traveling faster than the speed of sound. When it strikes soft tissue, it does not puncture. It liquefies. When it strikes half-inch naval steel, it does not bounce. It burrows. And on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, Paul Gunn's impossible gunships did not fire one round. They fired thousands. 09:58 hours. Altitude, 50 feet. Major Ed Larner leads the 90th Bomb Squadron in from the southeast. They are not flying in a bomber formation. They are flying line abreast, wingtip to wingtip, a solid wall of aluminum stretching 300 yards wide across the wavetops. The noise is apocalyptic. 24 Wright Cyclone engines screaming at maximum continuous power, churning the ocean surface into a white mist behind them. Ahead of them lies the Japanese transport Kyokusei Maru. The Japanese captain stands on the bridge. He sees the dots on the horizon. He orders hard to starboard. He calculates the trajectory of a high-altitude bomb run. He expects the Americans to be at 10,000 feet. He expects to have 40 seconds to maneuver. But the dots do not climb. They grow larger, and they are not dropping bombs. They are spitting fire. Range, 1,000 yards. Larner's thumb depresses the solenoid button on the control yoke. The nose of his B-25 erupts. 14 M2 Brownings fire simultaneously. The recoil is so violent the airspeed indicator drops 10 knots instantly. The airframe shudders as if it has hit a brick wall. From the 12 B-25s, 168 machine guns open up in unison. It creates a cone of death, a geometric impossibility where the air is occupied by more lead than oxygen. The tracers look like a laser beam, a solid red line connecting the aircraft nose to the ship. But the physics at the impact point are not visual. They are kinetic. The rounds hit the water first, skipping off the surface like flat stones, walking toward the hull. Then they strike the Kyokusei Maru. The bridge disintegrates. The glass windows shatter into dust. The wooden decking splinters into millions of lethal projectiles. The steel bulkheads are perforated like Swiss cheese. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews on the bow, men trained to track high-altitude bombers, never even get to traverse their guns. 1 second they are standing. The next, they are red mist. The density of fire is so high it acts like a chainsaw, physically cutting through the ship's superstructure. Range, 300 yards. The strafing run is not the kill shot. It is the suppression. It is designed to make the enemy put their heads down. Now comes the hammer. Larner and his wingmen do not pull up. They stay on the deck. At 240 knots, the ship fills the windshield in a heartbeat. Release. 500-pound bombs drop from the bays. They do not fall vertically. They carry the forward momentum of the aircraft. They hit the water at a shallow angle. Skip. Skip. Slam. The first bomb ricochets off the waves, jumps over the torpedo nets, and smashes into the steel hull of the Kyokusei Maru squarely amidships, just above the waterline. It doesn't explode on impact. It has a 4-second delay fuse. The bomb punches through the steel plating, enters the engine room, and settles among the boilers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Detonation! The ocean surface bulges. A column of water and debris shoots 300 feet into the air. The ship's spine snaps. The Kyokusei Maru is dead in the water before the B-25s have even retracted their bomb bay doors. Target 2. The transport Teiyo Maru. The captain of the Teiyo Maru sees his sister ship die. He screams for a full-ahead flank. He wants 15 knots. But the B-25s are doing 300 miles per hour. The geometry of interception is cruel. 4 strafers bracket the transport, 2 from the port bow, 2 from the starboard quarter. They cross the T. The converging fire from 56 machine guns meets at a single point. The bridge. The executive officer takes 3 rounds to the chest, his torso effectively erased. The captain lasts 10 seconds longer before a burst cuts him in half at the waist. The ship is now headless. It is steaming in a circle. 8 bombs drop. 5 hit. The explosions are internal. The hull plates blow outward. The ship breaks clean in 2. Japanese soldiers in the hold, thousands of them fully geared for the invasion of New Guinea, are thrown into the churning water. The suction of the sinking halves drags them down. Their heavy packs act as anchors. 6 minutes. That is the time elapsed from the first strafing run to the Teiyo Maru vanishing beneath the surface. Target 3. The destroyer Shikinami. This is a warship. It has armor, it has teeth. It is designed to fight other ships. But it was not designed to fight a swarm of wasps. Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters hit it first, stripping the anti-aircraft defenses with 20mm cannon fire. The deck is a slaughterhouse of twisted metal and burning sailors. Then the B-25s arrive. The destroyer captain tries to turn into the attack, to present the narrowest profile. But the strafers are everywhere. They attack from 3 different headings simultaneously. If he turns to face one, he exposes his broadside to the other 2. He is trapped in a lethal triangulation. Bombs away. Impact port, impact starboard, impact amidships. The destroyer shudders violently. The boilers rupture. Steam vents scream as the pressure escapes. The Shikinami lists 20 degrees in 30 seconds. It is a floating wreck, burning from bow to stern, helpless against the relentless aluminum sharks circling for the kill. The carnage is total. By 14 hours, the Strafer pilots return with fresh bombs. The transport Teiyo Maru takes 12 hits. 12. The ship's magazine, stored with artillery shells for the Leh garrison, detonates. The explosion is visible from Port Moresby, 130 miles away. 1 second, there is a ship carrying 1,800 men. The next second, there is only a hole in the ocean and a rain of burning debris. No survivors, no wreckage. Just physics converting matter into energy in the most violent way possible. The water of the Bismarck Sea is no longer blue. It is slick with oil, it is choked with flotsam, and it is red. This was not a battle. This was an execution by machine. The impossible gunships didn't just work. They rewrote the rules of naval warfare with 50 caliber ink. The silence does not come all at once. It arrives in pieces. First, the roar of the Wright Cyclone engines fades into a distant drone, moving south, back toward Papua, back to the safety of Allied airfields. Then, the secondary explosions cease. The magazines that have been cooking off, sending geysers of white water and jagged steel into the sky, finally exhaust themselves. The screaming, the shouts of officers trying to organize lifeboats that no longer exist. Those sounds are swallowed by the vast, indifferent rhythm of the ocean. And then, there is only the water. March 4th, 1943, the Huon Gulf, drifting, the oil. It burns the eyes. It sits on the surface of the sea like a black shroud. Thick, viscous, coating everything it touches. It coats the wooden planks of shattered crates. It coats the bobbing pith helmets of the dead. It coats the lungs of the living. I am holding on to a piece of decking from the Kyokusei Maru. My hands are numb, slippery with fuel oil and blood. I try to wipe my face, but my sleeve is soaked in the same filth. There is no clean place left in this world. I look around me, and I see the wreckage of an army. Thousands of men left Rabaul. We were the 51st Division. We were the Emperor's hammer, destined to drive the Allies out of New Guinea. Now, we are just debris. I saw Private Sato go under. He jumped from the rail when the ship broke in half. He was wearing his full kit, his pack, his ammunition pouches, his helmet. He followed orders. He kept his equipment because a soldier does not abandon his duty. But the water does not care about duty. The weight. 50 pounds of wet canvas and steel. It dragged him down like a stone. He didn't scream. He just looked at me, eyes wide, hand reaching up, and then the black water closed over his fingers. He is down there now, marching along the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, with hundreds of others, an army of ghosts standing at attention in the dark. The destroyer Asashio came for us. Earlier, it was a beautiful ship, fast, sharp. It maneuvered through the wreckage, its crew throwing ropes, nets, anything to pull us from the oil. For a moment, I felt hope. I thought, we are saved. But then the aluminum sharks returned. They came from the sun, silent until they were right on top of us. The modified A-20s, the Havocs. The crew of the Asashio was distracted, focused on pulling drowning men from the water. They didn't see the Strafers until the guns opened up. I watched from the water. Helpless, the bullets walked across the deck of the destroyer, cutting down the sailors who were trying to save us. The water around the ship boiled with machine gun fire. And then the bombs hit. The bridge collapsed. The ship listed. The very vessel that was supposed to be our salvation became another tomb. It burned through the night, a funeral pyre reflecting on the black oil until dawn took it. Now, there is nothing. March 5th, 1943, Rabaul, the hospital. The room is quiet, but it is not peaceful. It is the silence of men who have seen the end of the world. We are the lucky ones, the rescued. 2,700 of us were pulled from the water by the surviving destroyers and submarines before they turned tail and ran. We were brought back here, to Rabaul, back to where we started. But we are not the same men who left. I try to write a letter to my wife, but my hand shakes uncontrollably. What can I tell her? Can I tell her about the Kyokusei Maru? Can I tell her that 1,800 men, an entire regiment, vanished in the blink of an eye? There was no battle. There was no glory. There was just a flash of light, a thunderclap that cracked my eardrums, and then empty ocean. 1,800 souls, fathers, sons, husbands, gone in 3 seconds, vaporized. The nurses move quietly between the cots. They change bandages, they offer water, but they do not look us in the eye. They know. They have heard the whispers. The convoy is gone. All of it. The transports, sunk. The destroyers, sunk. The supplies, the ammunition, the food, all at the bottom of the sea. And the enemy? The pilots speak of them in hushed tones. They call them the Black Death. We were told the Americans were soft. We were told they relied on high-altitude bombing because they were afraid to get close. We were told their bombers were slow, clumsy, vulnerable. But the things that attacked us, they were not bombers. They were monsters. I saw one pass directly over me as I floated in the water. It was so low I could see the rivets on the belly. It didn't look like a machine. It looked like a predator. The nose was solid, no glass, just gun barrels. Rows and rows of black eyes staring down at us, spitting fire. It skipped bombs across the water like a child skipping stones on a pond. How do you fight that? How do you fight an enemy who takes a heavy bomber, strips out the safety, bolts on 20 guns, and flies it at mast height? The officers say we will regroup. They say we will find another way to reinforce Leh. But I look at the empty cots in the barracks, and I know the truth. The sea is closed to us. General MacArthur has released a statement. We heard it on the American radio broadcast. He called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Annihilating. It is a cold word, a clinical word. It implies the removal of an obstacle, the erasing of a mistake. But to be annihilated is to be unmade. I close my eyes, and I am back in the water. I feel the oil on my skin. I hear the groaning of the Kyokusei Maru as she breaks. I see Sato's hand reaching up from the depths. We were the 51st Division. We were the pride of the Empire. Now, we are just a lesson in American engineering. A statistic in a report filed by a man named Gunn. The silence here in the hospital is heavy. It is the silence of a tide that has turned and will never come back in. The calculus of war is usually a game of slim margins. A commander spends a battalion to take a hill. An admiral sacrifices a cruiser to save a carrier. It is a ledger of bloody transactions where the best you can usually hope for is to break even. But in the Bismarck Sea, Paul Gunn did not play by the rules of accounting. He broke the bank. Let's look at the balance sheet of March 3rd, 1943. Cost to the Allies, 4 aircraft, 1 B-17, 3 P-38 Lightnings, 13 aircrew killed. Cost to the Empire of Japan, 8 transport ships, sunk, 4 destroyers, sunk, 20 aircraft, destroyed, 2,890 soldiers and sailors, dead. The exchange rate was not tactical. It was catastrophic. For every single American airman lost, the Japanese Empire lost 222 men. For every aluminum airplane scratched from the roster, the Imperial Navy lost 3 ships. This was not a victory. It was a liquidation. Analyze the firepower density. The first wave of 12 B-25 Strafers carried a total of 168 forward-firing machine guns. At a cyclic rate of 800 rounds per minute per gun, that formation could deliver 215 pounds of projectiles per second. In a 10-second strafing run, that equals 2,150 pounds of lead impacting a target area the size of a tennis court. That is more weight in projectiles than a broadside from a light cruiser, delivered by aircraft flying at mast height. Consider the impossible engineering. The experts at Wright Field in Ohio, the men with the slide rules and the clean desks, declared the B-25 gunship impractical. They said the nose was too heavy. They said the stress loads were too high. They recommended grounding the fleet. General Kenny sent them a memo with 1 paragraph. He didn't send calculations. He sent a body count. Commerce destroyer modifications approved for production. The result? North American aviation didn't just accept the design. They industrialized it. They took Gunn's hand-drawn sketches, stained with grease and sweat, and turned them into the B-25G, the B-25H, and the B-25J, 5,000 Strafers built. 5,000 impossible airplanes rolled off the assembly lines in California, each one a carbon copy of the machine Pappy Gunn built in a junkyard in Brisbane. And the long-term ROI, return on investment? The commerce destroyer lived up to its name. By the end of the war, these modified B-25s had achieved the following totals in the Pacific Theater alone. 800 Japanese ships sunk. 2,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 85,000 enemy soldiers killed. Stop and process that number. 85,000. That is not a regiment. That is not a division. That is an entire field army. That is the population of a mid-sized city, wiped off the map by a mechanic who decided that bombardiers were a waste of space. The strategic impact was absolute. Before the Strafers, the Japanese reinforced their island garrisons with convoys. They moved divisions by sea. They believed the ocean was their highway. After March 3rd, 1943, the convoys stopped. They never again attempted to move a large force by sea into New Guinea. The Black Death, as the Japanese infantry called them, severed the arteries of the empire. Garrisons starved. Ammunition dumps sat empty. The 51st Division, destined to hold Leh, simply ceased to exist. And the cost of the weapon itself? A B-25 Mitchell cost approximately $96,000 in 1943 currency. The 50 caliber machine guns were salvaged from wrecked fighters for free. The labor was performed by enlisted mechanics working overtime. Paul Gunn built a weapon that could sink a destroyer, a vessel costing millions of dollars and taking 2 years to build, using scrap metal and spare parts. This was asymmetric warfare before the term existed. The Japanese invested in battleships. They invested in cruisers. They invested in the rigid, honorable doctrine of naval supremacy. The Americans invested in a 43-year-old grandfather with a welding torch and a vendetta. The Japanese surely understood the math of ballistics. But they failed to calculate the coefficient of American rage. When you multiply 14 machine guns by the motivation of a man whose family is in a prison camp, the result isn't just a victory. It is a mathematical impossibility that sinks fleets. The realization did not come as a sudden epiphany. It arrived like a slow, creeping frost in the tropics. It began in the radio rooms of Rabaul and Truk, where the chatter of confident captains turned into the silence of missing ships. For 2 years, the Japanese soldier had been taught that the night belonged to the emperor, and the day was contested but manageable. He had been taught that the American bomber was a high-altitude nuisance, a clumsy giant that dropped explosives from the stratosphere, missing more often than it hit. He had been conditioned to look up, but after the Bismarck Sea, he learned to look down. The survivors who washed ashore didn't speak of bombers. They spoke of a black shape that skimmed the waves like a seabird. They spoke of a nose that did not have glass eyes, but iron teeth. They called it the Black Death. Intelligence Report. Imperial Japanese Navy, April 1943. The tone of the reports changed. The bravado evaporated. The tactical officers, men who had spent their lives studying the rigid, honorable rules of naval engagement, found themselves trying to describe a weapon that refused to fight fair. How do you maintain morale when the enemy doesn't bomb you? He executes you. The psychological break happened when the convoys stopped. The ocean, once the lifeline of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, became a no-man's land. Supplies rotted on the docks of Rabaul because no captain wanted to take his ship into the range of the Strafers. Reinforcements sat idle because the transport commanders refused to sail in daylight. The fear was specific. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the fear of helplessness. In a traditional air raid, you have time. You see the formation. You man the guns. You fire back. There is a ritual to it. But the Strafers took that ritual away. By the time you saw them rising from the wave tops, your bridge was already dissolving under a stream of 50 caliber rounds. By the time you reached for the trigger, you were already dead. This paralysis spread to the airfields. The pilots of the Zero fighters, the samurai of the sky, began to avoid head-on passes with American bombers. Why? Because they learned that the clumsy American bomber now had more firepower in its nose than an entire squadron of fighters. To fly head-on into a B-25 was to fly into a meat grinder. The hunter had become the prey. The psychological collapse wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. The Japanese military ethos was built on the idea of spirit overcoming matter, that superior will could defeat superior numbers. But Pappy Gunn had built a machine that rendered spirit irrelevant. 14 machine guns do not care about your honor. They do not care about your ancestors. They only care about physics. And faced with that wall of lead, the spirit broke. The silence returned to the shipping lanes. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of abandonment. The garrisons in New Guinea starved. The ammunition bunkers stood empty. The grand strategy of the empire was strangled not by a fleet of battleships, but by the fear of what lay waiting just above the waves. The Japanese commanders looked at their maps, at the blue expanse of the Bismarck Sea, and they no longer saw water. They saw a graveyard. And they knew, deep in the quiet parts of their minds, that the war was lost. Not because they ran out of ships, but because they ran out of the courage to sail them. The war ended for Paul Gunn, not with a bang, but with a quiet walk into a hospital room in Manila. February 4th, 1945. The dust of the liberation battle still hung in the air. The sound of artillery still rumbled in the distance. Gunn walked into the makeshift ward at Santo Tomas. He was 45 years old. His hair was completely white. He walked with a cane because his leg was full of shrapnel from the bomb at Tacloban. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a ghost. His wife, Polly, weighed 89 pounds. She was a skeleton wrapped in translucent skin. She didn't recognize him at first. She thought he was a doctor. That is the brutal intimacy of war. It takes a man who can sink a fleet and turns him into a stranger to the people he fought to save. But he had done it. The impossible gunship had cleared the path. The Strafers had severed the supply lines, starved the garrisons, and opened the road to Manila. He held his family again. The mathematics of his war finally balanced. Post-war, 1946, the world tried to go back to normal. The B-25s were scrapped, melted down into aluminum ingots to make toasters and siding for suburban houses. Gunn retired. He went back to the Philippines. He rebuilt Philippine Airlines from the ashes, starting with 3 surplus C-47s. He traded his machine guns for passenger seats. He traded his commerce destroyer for a schedule of flights to Hong Kong and Bangkok. He became a civilian, a businessman, a father. But the legacy of Pappy's folly didn't retire. It lived on in the blueprints of North American aviation. It lived on in the design philosophy of every attack aircraft that followed. The AC-130 gunship circling over Vietnam. That was Gunn's concept. overwhelmed firepower in a transport airframe. The A-10 Warthog, a plane built around a massive rotary cannon? That was Gunn's philosophy. The gun is the primary flight instrument. Every time a modern aircraft points its nose at the ground and unleashes a wall of lead to support infantry, the ghost of Paul Gunn is in the cockpit. And yet, the end was a cruel irony. October 11th, 1957. The man who had survived the Coral Sea, the Bismarck Sea, the liberation of the Philippines, the man who had flown through walls of flak that would shred a lesser pilot, flew into a thunderstorm near Baguio. He wasn't in a gunship. He was in a Beechcraft Model 18. He wasn't fighting Zeros. He was fighting the wind. And this time, the physics won. He died on the side of a mountain, surrounded by rain and silence. 6,000 people attended his funeral. General Kenny sent a wreath. The newspapers called him a war hero, but today his name is not in the history books alongside MacArthur or Nimitz. His original drawings, the pencil sketches that sank a Navy, sit in a glass case in Texas, yellowing with age. Most people have never heard of Paul Gunn. They don't know that the safety of the Pacific was secured by a mechanic with a welding torch. They don't know that the impossible airplane is the reason the 51st Division never reached Leh. But the history of warfare knows. It remembers that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a new bomb or a secret code. It is a man who refuses to accept that. Impossible is an option. The smoke clears, and silence returns. Thank you for walking through this heavy chapter of history with me today. It is not easy to look directly into the past, uncovered and naked, but doing so is the best way to honor those who lived through it. If you value these deep analyses and want to explore the truth together, please leave a like and subscribe. It truly helps keep these archives open. I would love to read your thoughts on this topic in the comments section below. See you in the next story. Take care.